First of all, it's wonderful to see so many friendly, happy, interested faces here. And I am slightly disheveled just because I ran from office hours, et cetera, so I'm catching my breath, but I am absolutely delighted to be here. I'm really excited to introduce this, I won't introduce the book, but I'll introduce the author and the two commentators. Before I say a word about this, I do want to say that it really is gives me, this is not scripted, but it really does give me a great pleasure to have sitting here two marvelous, exceptionally marvelous young assistant professors from Mises, and as chair of Mises, at least for the moment, it just fills me with I don't know if to call it maternal pride. That might be much, but just a good feeling to have such good folks here. So I will start by introducing Isabel Huacuja Alonso, whose book is a magnificent, really exceptional book. I still remember the first conversation Isabel and I had during your visit after your job talk, and I remember feeling, oh my God, we have to have this person, the breadth of thought about matters that range from politics of partition, the harmful impact of colonialism, and the politics of language and culture, and the not less important, in fact, in my mind, even more important, the hopeful nuance of what people and popular culture can do even under those systematic systems of oppression, I think is absolutely exceptional and imperative for this book and for what it is that we do as scholars who also want to be critical, but also hopeful, if I may say. So Isabel, as most of us know, is an assistant professor at the Department of Middle East, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University Mises. This book is her first book, Radio for the Millions, Hindi-Urdu Broadcasting Across Borders, and it came out January of this year. It is a transnational history of radio broadcasting in Hindi and Urdu from the late colonial period through the early post-independence era, roughly 1920 to 1980. The book argues, and I'm sure we will hear about it, that the medium of the radio enabled listeners and broadcasters to contest the cultural, linguistic, and political agendas of the British colonial administration and the subsequent independent Indian and Pakistani governments. This book draws on earlier work that was done for the dissertation at the University of Texas, Austin, and that dissertation won the Sartor Petal Award for the best dissertation in any aspect of modern India defended at a U.S. institution. Sorry, defended at a U.S. institution. It also gives me a great honor to introduce and host Inés Casillas, who is a professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies and the director of Chicano Studies Institute, CSI, at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research focuses on immigrant engagement within U.S. Spanish language and bilingual culture, as well as the integration of ethnic studies within K-12 schools. She's the author of Sounds of Belonging, U.S. Spanish Language Radio and Public Advocacy, which is NYU Press, came out in 2014. The book has received 2 book awards. She's also the co-editor with Maria Elena Quipeda from Williams College, to the companion to Latino Media Studies, Routledge Press from 2016, and co-editor with Mary Bachelotz, am I saying this correctly? Bachelotz. And Jin Sok Lee from UC Santa Barbara for the book Feeling It, Language, Race, and Affect in Latinx Youth Learning, that came out from Routledge Press in 2018. Finally, Debashri Mukherjee is also an assistant professor at the Department of Middle East, South Asian, African Studies at Columbia University, Misas. Beforehand, and that's quite fancy, she has worked in the Mumbai film and television industries from 2004 to 2007. So we also have some kind of celebrity connections. I'm still working on it, but it's going to happen. She is a scholar of film, media studies, feminist decolonial historiography, environmental humanities, technology studies. The book, Bombay Hustle, Making Movies in a Colonial City, came out in Columbia Press, 2020. I cannot believe it's already that long. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. If you haven't read it, you must. The book presents a practitioner's eye view on filmmaking activity in late colonial Bombay, approaching cinema as an ecology of energy relations that connects the studio and the screen. I'm delighted, and I hope you all join me in welcoming. And they are here. The guests of honor have arrived. And so you haven't missed anything, because this person was just saying rumbling things. So our first speaker is going to be Isabel, who is going to introduce her book. Let me just explain. Isabel's going to introduce the book for 8 to 10 minutes. Followed by 2 of our commentaries of the same length. And then Isabel will take a few minutes to respond, and then we will open to Q&A. And so hold on, keep your questions, and we'll get back to everybody. And then the food. And then the food, but we're not here for that. Thank you. Do I have to stand here with the microphone? Yes, right? Okay. So we were talking about this, that I have 10 minutes and it's been 12 years of working on the project. So I think I have 12 minutes because it's 1 minute per year, all right? I think that's what I get. But thank you, first of all, thank you for coming here. It's really an honor to be here, and it's really exciting to see so many people. Thank you to Lindsay and Sylvia for organizing it, and thank you for the panelists for coming and for the audience. So since I have 12 minutes, I'm going to jump into it. So in May 2007, the then 75-year-old Bombay broadcaster Amin Sayani visited Pakistan for the first time. And Sayani spoke before the packed Arts Council Auditorium in Karachi about his lifelong affair with Hindi film songs and about his career with Radio Ceylon. Radio Ceylon was a commercial station located in the nearby country of Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, but with a strong ties to the film industry in Bombay. And that night, Sayani charmed the audience with his characteristic greeting of Beheno or Baiyo, sisters and brothers, and played a remake of his old radio programs, which likely sounded like this.
मधुर मशहूर फिल्म संगीत के बचपन और जवानी की यादें याद किया दिल ने कहा हो तुम झूमती बहार है कहा हो तुम प्यार से पुकार लो जहां हो तुम प्यार से पुकार लो जहां हो तुम याद किया दिल ने कहा
You have to start with that, right?
अरे भाई यही तो है वो सुरमई मनभावन यादें जी हाँ यही दुनिया के सबसे ज्यादा लंबे अरसे तक चलने वाले रेडियो प्रोग्राम गीत माला के इस नए सिलसिले में जिसका प्यारा सा नाम है गीत माला की छाव में.
So what you just heard is the voice of Amin Sayani introducing Hindi film songs from the 1950s and talking about his iconic radio program, Binaka Gitmala.
That night, some members of the audience cheered enthusiastically, while others quietly shed tears, overwhelmed by nostalgia. This was Sayani's first and only visit to Pakistan during his more than 40-year career. But it was clear from the audience enthusiasm that this Indian broadcaster's voice had long been part of the Pakistani soundscape. So Sayani's visit to Pakistan raises many questions about radio and sound's place in the subcontinent's popular cultures, but also about the medium's entanglement in the nation-making projects that so profoundly shaped the 20th century. What is the significance of film songs and film circulation on the airwaves? What are the aesthetic and commercial implications of this convergence? What was radio's role in the end of British rule in the Indian subcontinent? What do radio salons' verbose transnational publics tell us about the culture and political possibilities of the medium, and about the contentious politics of language in the region? And above all, the stories here ask us, the Sayani stories ask us, what was radio's role in the making and unmaking of the subcontinent borders? And these are the questions that animate the book. The book, as you know already, brings together two fields that are rarely in conversation. So first, the rich and growing literature of sound studies, especially works on radio, but also 20th century South Asian history, and particularly works on the end of empire and the anti-colonial movement, independence, and the subsequent partition of India. Now, the study is organized around language. As many of the audience surely know, Hindi and Urdu are North Indian languages with over 500 million speakers throughout South Asia, and they share the same grammar and vocabulary and colloquial speech, but they're written in different scripts, and they have developed distinct literary traditions. And during the communal tensions that ultimately culminated in the 1947 partition of India into independent India and Pakistan, Hindi became increasingly associated with Hindu communities and Urdu with Muslims. The study analyzes various radio stations that broadcast in Hindi and or Urdu, including the national stations All India Radio, Radio Pakistan, the BBC Hindustani services, and of course, Radio Ceylon. But it also analyzes stations located outside the Indian subcontinent and the UK that aim their services at South Asian populations. The book consists of 3 parts. We have the next one. And each part focuses on a key moment when radio became a matter of contentious debate and on a genre of radio that was especially important at the time that is studied. So I look at news during World War II, music during the post-colonial decade in India and Pakistan, and what I call dramatic radio during the 1965 war and its aftermath. And each section covers key moments during which the colonial administration, the Indian government, and the Pakistani government turned to the medium of radio to assert their legitimacy and authority. And in pursuing the research, I consulted sources, a variety of them, including official records, recordings, broadcasts, radio journals, magazines, memoirs, and most importantly, interviewed broadcasters and radio personalities. And I followed the radio waves whose boundaries were determined not by the physical borders that are imposed by newly formed governments, but by the strength of transmitters and radio receivers, and most importantly, by the programming preferences of listeners. So in this way, the book attempts to present a new geography of radio, or a geography of radio centered on language groups, rather than national or regional borders, or even radio stations. And then I want to just very briefly outline some of the arguments that I hope to make in the book. So the first one, which you just heard from Gil, is that despite the British, can we go to the next slide? And just to give you a sense, these are the stations which archives I consulted, or which people that worked on this archives I spoke to for this particular study. And to outline some of the arguments, so as Gil noted, the book argues that despite the British, Indian, and Pakistani politicians' repeated and consistent efforts to usurp the medium for state purposes, the medium of radio in South Asia effectively contested the cultural, linguistic, and political agendas of the British colonial administration and later independent Indian and Pakistani governments. Now, in conversation with works on sound studies, I also developed the concept of radio resonance. And this is to analyze how conversation, rumor, and gossip could intensify, expand, and enrich radio broadcasts. And the important part is that radio programs' influence extended beyond the reach of receivers, because radio was not only listened to, but also talked about. And that conversation was not supplementary, but actually central to the medium's reception. To talk was, in a way, to listen. Now, this might seem quite a simple argument to make, but it actually forces us to seriously reconsider foundational ideas, and in particular, rethink the division between orality and orality. And then third, a guiding conviction of this book, and I know this is one where Devashri will agree with me here, has been that the study of media forms, and in particularly sound media, actually everybody in this panel will agree with me, is fundamental to the study of history, and that radio history is history. So attention to sources, to sound sources, forces to rethink, just to begin, the standard periodization of the region's history. Moving away from the nation-making events of 1947 and 1971, the independence of India and Pakistan, and later Bangladesh in 1971, and recasting World War II and the 1965 Indo-Pakistan War, long dismissed as watershed events. But most importantly, the book's chapters together make it clear that Pakistan and India's shared history did not end at partition. And then finally, because I only have like 2 minutes left for my 1 minute per year, right? Finally, to end, I hope that the book shows the value of three things. One is that moving beyond the value of moving beyond official archives, national archives, and imperial archives, and to really search beyond that, which takes time and dedication, and above all, resilience. It is the product of many years of research for that reason. Second, I hope it shows the value of interdisciplinary research, which requires simply a lot more work, but also a lot more risk, because it means you open up yourself up to criticisms from other fields as well. And I also hope the book shows the value of maybe non-conventional positionalities. I draw on my own experience growing up in the US-Mexico borderlands, which I believed attuned me to the ways borders could be both simultaneously rigid and porous. But I want to end, the last slide, I want to end by thanking the people who made this possible. Yes, my friends, my mentors, fantastic editor Philip sitting here, my children, my husband, my family, but also the broadcasters and listeners who told me their stories, trusted them with them, and shared their collections. And I wish to name just a few: Yawar Mahendi, Mariam Kasmi, Farooq Jafar, Jyoti Parmar, and Amin Sayani, who is reading the book now.
Do you want me to speak from there? It's here. It's okay. Okay, great. You're correct. Hi, I'm Ines, and I made the journey all the way from sunny UC Santa Barbara to be here. And she's so grateful and so sweet. And I told her, this is going to be your moment years later where you're going to pay it forward. We're going to see another woman of color who finished a book, who took a long time, who took a risk to do it on radio, and you're going to repay them this way. So it's a pleasure to be here. So I enjoyed this book, not just as a scholar of radio and sound, but as someone who studies immigrant engagement with Spanish language media in the United States. I specifically look at the ways in which we listen to Spanish language radio, the immigrant dominant population. And this is New York City, the #1 radio market in the US. So I know you have heard or overheard a lot of Spanish language radio in the city. So this study of sound, as she argues, joins others in insisting that radio plays unique and affective roles in various state-making and often unstate-making projects. Her engagement with transnational as well as US ethnic, or what she terms sometimes as minoritized radio studies, is very unique. And I can't stress how placing those in conversation takes a lot of nuance, and it takes a lot of reading, and it takes a lot of thinking into seeing like where are the parallels, but where are the distinctions that should be very much articulated. And so she has me thinking a lot more about India from the 1930s to the 1980s, and also has taken the first step in trying to place a lot of global studies scholarship also in conversation with each other. So as a medium, broadcast radio, so speaking from a radio studies perspective, has increasingly been neglected in the mainstream media in favor of our more digital darlings. And this means our podcast, our Spotify lists, our Pandora settings. Listening to radio, though, in whatever format, has always been characterized by class, race, and I argue in my work, one's legal status. And she definitely argues by language in her work. Radio for the Millions responds to the classic lyric and argument that, quote, video killed the radio star, unquote. She responds with a book that traces just how essential listening and talking about the news, dramas, and singing along to film soundtracks worked hand in hand to bolster how we view television and film today. Alonso joins a bout of recent publications within just the last 10 years with the argument that no, broadcast radio cannot be killed. I have long argued that the abandonment of broadcast radio across different global South countries often lend itself to have the most disenfranchised seize it. Not just the simple affordability or relative affordability to radio, especially as opposed to an internet connection or Wi-Fi connection, but it unapologetically always directs its attention to the disenfranchised listener. So this has really very much propelled its growth. And I have to admit that I've often have relied on numbers. And this is when reading her work has really challenged me. I insist in my work that yes, Spanish language broadcast radio is significant because it's in the top 5 radio markets in the US, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and Miami. And that we routinely see Spanish language call numbers on subway stations and bus stations. But Radio for the Millions convinced me that an argument about a non-English language medium and a media set definitely considered the uncool cousin within the media family does not need numbers. Alonso writes that no, there wasn't a record number of radio sets sold during her decade of study. And no, there's no way to track how many people were tuning into specific shows. And that said, an impact does not need to be quantified. And an impact can still be felt quite palpably. Alonso's greatest intervention in radio studies and sound studies is definitely in her insightful concept about radio resonance. And I can't stress this point enough. Radio resonance accounts for ways in which talking about what we listen to creates affective bonds. And this might be something somewhat foreign to us now because we see a TikTok trend, we do it and we talk about it, but it really is foundational. So before you talk about that TikTok trend, think about how that started with radio, right? She's reminding us about how that was foundational during that time. That rumor, gossip, conversation aren't empty fillers, but they're actually creative, everyday forms of talking about politics. Radio offered fodder for communal get-togethers, and these genres is a different way of understanding the national politics of the time. In this manner, radio became something we not only listened to, but something we talked about. Radio could really, Alonso argues, reach the millions precisely because of the resounding chatter. She stresses that despite radio's real-time capabilities, which offers transgressive possibilities, it's also useful to explore how radio shows and messages resonated over time and not just in real time. And this has challenged my work in knowing, for instance, I write about warnings about INS or now ICE sightings in public, that people will call radio stations and over the air use code words. So the 1980s, they would say, I have a migraine on 3rd and West. And people would know there was an INS sighting there, la migra, migraine. And 10 years ago in Los Angeles, we had a bout of raids, courtesy of our then President Trump. And somebody went on the air and they named off an intersection and started playing the jingle, Ice, Ice, Baby, to warn everybody. And this was I have always argued it's because it's in real time and it's not documented and it's this and it's that. And she reminds me that it's not just the instance of something being real time, it's that it resonates over time. It's that it's 10 years later and I'm still talking about it, right? It's that I choose what code words to share in public and whatnot. And secondly, another thing about resonance, I was thinking about the Occupied movement and all the restrictions we have on sound and permissions to broadcast sound. And somebody would speak and then other people would repeat it so the people in the back could hear. So that sense of resonance that I don't need your permission to be loud or to continue with this protest, it centers around sound. So Radio for the Millions surprised me when I first heard about her initial arguments. We have actually only Zoomed once. So this is what happens when you find someone on Twitter that actually will respond and Zoom with you. And then I read her manuscript and it stunned me. Here she was, gently yet adamantly arguing to look at radio as much more than some kind of window towards the past or to look at it as the historical record, to explain these turbulent moments in India. But instead, she insists quite convincingly that this is a recovery project, a form of decolonizing archival sources. Yet she's also decolonizing us and our often too stubborn ways in which we define legitimate sources, which are often in print. Or we fetishize that radio can only be studied through documented, well-preserved audio. She's encouraging historians to not use radio as a way of providing context, but to truly use radio and archive as a form of engagement for their study. Or what she asks throughout the book, a radio host asks this, and then she ends the book by asking herself, where are you and where is your voice? And that to me, you didn't specifically tie this, but I'm like, this is her engagement with the book. She starts by talking about a radio host challenging her engagement and then ends the book by asking us, also the readers, what is your voice, right, in this listen? So I often quote Andrew Crisnell, a radio historian, who insisted, as I do, that, quote, radio is not an account of what has happened, but rather an account of what is happening, unquote. In other words, how this unique early history of radio has set the foundation to also how we listen to the diaspora today. So now in California, our Interstate 5, those familiar with California, is a freeway that's our spine. It runs from Tijuana to Medford, Oregon. And if you've had the unfortunate experience of driving up and down I-5, you know well that it's a straight shot of a freeway that privileges big rigs, very large delivery trucks. With only truck stops, there isn't a Starbucks in sight. There's a lot of bad diner coffee. There's a manure smell, courtesy of our beef industry. But it's also here when I drive the I-5 that I stumble across Punjabi Radio USA, which mainly broadcasts in California, but I think USA sounds more official. So they kind of add the USA behind it to make it sound a lot more grandiose. A radio station on 93.1 dial that caters to the disproportionate number of truck drivers who have found employment from Punjabi driving big rigs. The best Indian food I've ever had was outside a truck stop outside Turlock, California. These broadcasts advise on the best places to rest, and by best, it means the places that will not give them a long second glance. It means the place that will not lie when they do have a place where you can rest and park your rig. And during the pandemic, this radio station was one of the few companions for these truck drivers when they couldn't really be in public during this time. And I often have listened, sometimes detected their urgency in their voice, their playful banter between hosts and callers, their monologues. And I know when they're reading a listener letter out loud, because the only thing I can tell, Fresno, California, Monterey, California, and then this long monologue that can really only be a listener letter. Alonso's attention to listener letters and dedications of Hindi film songs, specifically the intended sentimentality to broadcast that, and it's in chapter 6. It reminds me of Elena Razlova. She has a study of early US radio and listener letters, and she argues radio owed its survival to engagement with listeners, right? And in this particular instance, there's all these performances of reading the letters out loud. Listener letters tune in also to see if their letter was chosen, to see if they hear their name out loud, the sense of recognition that they are seeking. And Resglova reminds us, she uses the term a vernacular political economy to stress that listeners will use radio for communal interests despite corporate control. And Alonso's work speaks to that by focusing on state control during specific moments and how listeners will still do what they want. So I guess my last point is that radio's greatest gift is that it can be messy. Inevitably, people are heard talking over one another. A pause between segments or commercials might seem too long. But listening to radio's cadences and reading about how she listens to the cadences, the rhythms of speech, the patterns of language and music, this is how radio teaches us to listen. So I thank Isabel for placing scholars and scholarship once again, the Global South in conversation and the political urgency of that always, and for reminding us to do the work, that it's worth the risk, and that there's so much to listen to. So congratulations.
Okay, so that was lovely. Hard acts to follow. But first of all, let me just say thank you, Isabel, for inviting me to this conversation to celebrate your very, very wonderful book. And congratulations. I can't wait to see what the life is going to be for this book that was 12 years in the making, as are all of our books. So you're not an exception. If that just makes you feel any better, it's okay. I always take that. So I would like to begin with something that might be expected of me. I would like to begin with a Hindi film song and a visual this time, because I work on film, which is an audiovisual medium. So there's a song from a 1965 film. I chose 1965 as a nod to what for me was the most revelatory part of your book, because I'd heard bits before. The third section on the 1965 Indo-Pak War. So we can just play this. The two main protagonists are Feroz Khan and a transistor radio. So we can start. Okay. So it might seem a little bit ridiculous to us today, the spectacle of a grown man in an ecstatic waltz with a radio set. But it is quite instructive for our current discussion, and I want to pull out two kind of main points that help me engage with Isabel's book. So for one thing, histories of sound are notoriously difficult to study. The soundscapes of the past are ephemeral and elusive. Textual archives can record dates, names of places, even sensory descriptions, but they rarely convey a soundscape. And sound has also occupied a lower status in histories of the senses compared to, say, vision. And accordingly, sonic events have been under-archived and under-preserved. To add to this, ultimately, the human voice itself is a notoriously elusive entity to even define. It has an ambivalent ontological status. As Ana Maria Ochoa has noted, the voice possesses an ambiguous materiality because the voice is materially constituted simultaneously through the body by means of vibrating vocal cords and the world by means of the air that makes the cords move. And yet the voice doesn't belong fully to either the human body or the world, something in between. which is why this video has to do so much work to convey the power of the radio and the voice on the radio. The hero has to literally hold and embrace the transistor set to indicate what is the relationship between airwaves and human bodies. Now, all of this preface is to say that histories of sound are very difficult to write about, which is one of the challenges that Isabel has confronted, I think, so admirably, and with some very innovative and creative methods. Radio for the Millions spans about 6 decades in the history of the Indian subcontinent, roughly from the 1930s to the early 80s, and is structured according to 3 pivotal historical moments. And Isabel talks a little bit about why she chooses this frame of moments. Moments of social and political transition or upheaval, and moments wherein the radio as a social and a technological space becomes a very important historical actor. And those moments are kind of structuring the 3 parts of the book: the Second World War, the Partition, and the 1965 Indo-Pak War. Through a study of radio and the politics of sound, the book points to very important sonic strategies for state making, as well as sonic challenges to South Asian nationalisms. What's important to note is that of the many approaches that are available to someone that wants to do a history of radio, what Isabel has chosen is to approach radio largely as an embodied and an affective site of experience in order to situate it within a very layered politics of the region. And she very explicitly says that this is not a history, radio history of South Asia, but a very specific study of language groups, right? So it's a Hindi-Urdu kind of a story. Now, approached as an experiential form, rather than as a purely technical form or a purely ideological form, the question of evidence and radio becomes even more sticky. How do we excavate histories of listening as experience? So here Isabel comes up with a very important concept, radio resonance, to argue that we cannot judge the material and social presence of radio in late colonial and post-partition South Asia simply by judging the numbers of radio sets or radio stations. Rather, we must pay attention to the ways in which radio reverberates, resonates, far beyond that first immediate encounter between a listener and a machine, and further into widening circles of talk, gossip, rumor, excited chatter, all of which relay the messages and the meanings of radio to ever widening communities of listeners. So again then, what can an archive of radio resonance look like? And what is the evidence for the centrality of talk about radio to the history of radio? So Isabel mobilizes multiple methods and sources here. And I think this is one of the great gifts of the book, is that it's truly an exceptional work of archive production, not just recovery, excavation, but helping constitute a very disparate kind of array of materials into a kind of archive that we can now recognize. And I think that's a real innovation. Several methods are used, from close reading. I really enjoyed the moments of close reading of advertisements, of letters, interviews with, and the archives, some of the sources, I just want to kind of list them: colonial records, listener letters, interviews with broadcasters, diaries by fans, radio magazines and film magazines, and some very remarkable radio archives in Islamabad of Radio Pakistan's broadcasting during the 1965 war. Now, the radio played different roles at these different moments, fluctuating in its ideological resonance between linguistic nationalism, anti-colonial sentiment, and an evasive, affective community of lovers of music. In this, I find that the figure of Noor Jahan, actually, Malika Tarannum, becomes a symbol of the radio's fluctuating meanings in northern and western India and Pakistan. Because Noor Jahan could represent, for example, in the 1960s, a very Pakistani Punjabi nationalism, and that's the way her voice and her singing is mobilized. At the same time, and literally at the same time, in the same time period, she could also represent a symbol of a pre-partition nostalgic vision of a united India, again on the radio through her voice. So here I'd like to note a very exciting, if slightly slow, emergence in media histories of South Asia, which is a growing interest and a growing effort in narrating cross-border histories of film and radio, and with it, paying attention to cross-border archives. Lotte Hook has been doing some of this work for some time. You can see some of this in her essay called Cross-Wing Filmmaking, East Pakistani Urdu Films and Their Traces in the Bangladesh Film Archive. 2023 is an excellent year with Isabel's book and Salma Siddique's forthcoming book, which is titled Evacuee Cinema, Bombay and Lahore in Partition Transit, 1940 to 1960. Now, all three authors have chosen to revisit very complex histories of political and social transition all around the very vexed story of nation-state formations in South Asia, from partition to the creation of Bangladesh. And all three follow the media, so to speak, right? And it's partly because they choose to follow the media that some of these cross-border connections, I think, are more strongly enabled to tell truly cross-border histories. I think this is a real achievement in modern South Asian historiography, which has for long had a tendency to adopt by default some of the nationalist kind of restrictions in terms of which archives and sites we can study. Again, to sum this part of it up, is what I'm trying to say is that border crossing is then for Isabel and for this book, both a method and a subject, which is attentively tracked via concepts of sonic circulation through, again, border crossing citational practices that we already mentioned, picking up, say, Alex Chavez's sounds of crossing kind of concepts, and many sources such as listener letters. Now, the second reason I picked that video is to talk to a very strong theme in the book, which is the relationship between cinema and radio. And it highlights a very deep and intermediate relationship of film and radio. Scholars such as Nipa Majumdar, Vibhuti Duggal, and Kuhu Tanveer have been studying the faceted connections between radio and film, be it in the ways in which on-screen representations of radio and listening to radios on screen would train film viewers to a form of playful listening and imaginative listening, two ways in which radio popularized and circulated film songs and film dialogues far beyond the address of cinema and access to cinema for many, which is something that Isabel also very beautifully highlights. The cinema-radio relationship is very central to this story, especially the affective social binds created by Hindi film songs and their often subversive border-crossing potentialities. And in many ways, the book, for those that have even a tangential kind of experience of this musical history, it's a very emotional book. And by the time I got to chapter 6, I had like hearts doodled on the side. Right? But at the very outset, Isabel lays out the question of Hindu-Muslim religious politics that plagued India's radio soundscape since before independence, and announces at the same time that cinema, particularly Hindi-Urdu language cinema, has been the primary stage for this public contest. So not just the kind of utopian site of possibility, but really that arena for this kind of communal contest. As a corollary, another argument that is dear to the book is that this whole language and the language politics is a very big theme. It recurs over and over again in the book in different times with different inflections. And there is this, obviously, the debate about Hindi, Urdu, Hindustani. And one of the things that the book tells us is that despite the pronouncements that Hindustani died, right, at a particular moment, and very interesting, Isabel has a polemical kind of discussion about why she chooses the term Hindi-Urdu and eschews the term Hindustani to describe what she's describing. But Hindustani as a kind of utopian or a desire is evidenced and remained viable as a project via cinema and film lyrics and dialogue through the radio. One other interesting aspect I found in the cinema-radio relationship is that you don't describe it as such, but there is an element of stardom that starts to emerge, stardom, film stardom via radio, and also the creation of radio stars. So from Amin Sayani on Radio Ceylon to Abdul Jabbar for the AIR Urdu service, where their very unique vocal, dramatic, and performative personalities captivated audiences. Or the very important section in chapter 4, where you spend some time on the very carefully cultivated relationship between radio programs and playback singers, attributing this as a very important, playing a very important role to the emergence of the Hindi playback singer as a recognizable film celebrity, despite their invisibility on the screen, right? And I would very much agree with this point, and I would extend it to suggest that it is through radio presenters' insistence on naming and highlighting singers, composers, lyricists, that a whole ecology of behind the scenes music specialists became household names. So for example, just to say, अब सुनिए संगीतकार SD बर्मन का ये गीत मोहम्मद रफ़ी की आवाज में, मजरू सुल्तानपुरी के अल्फाजों में और देवानंद पे फिल्माया गया, right? So you're kind of laying out all the different people that are responsible, that come together in that one song that you might associate, if you had the luck to watch the film, with Devanand's face. And I think that's a very interesting thing. There's a lot of possibilities there. But one of the key contributions that Isabel makes here in this story of cinema and radio is to remind us and firmly underline the importance not just of cinema, but of war in consolidating the status of radio in South Asia. So very, very critical part of the book is discussions of the genres of war reportage, largely propaganda, information and misinformation, both during the Second World War and 1965, wherein radio became both an accomplice or an instrument of war, and also a site that produced great ambiguity and ideological ambivalence. And I highlight this because the radio story of the Second World War in India, for example, forces us to reckon with the very multivalent politics of South Asians during these years. So India is not simply an allied force in the Second World War, but there are several swirling ideological currents, from anti-colonialism, which then leads to, often for many, a sympathetic view of the Axis agenda, anti-European, anti-racism, but which also jostles somehow uneasily with fascist anti-Semitism. And all of these contradictions are things that Isabel is not unafraid, actually, to just really foreground. So there's a lot of things that I could talk about, many important and wonderful anecdotes, personages, Noor Jahan, of course, but some satirical radio dramas like Talkeen Shah, which you just mentioned briefly, but I'm like, what? Where it is a radio drama that allegorizes the Kashmir conflict in a very interesting way. Khalida Begum's very poignant letter, which you kind of close read. So I just want to wrap up by saying that any good book must be able to open up new sites of study, archives, and protagonists, for sure, right? But more than that, a good book helps us also unlearn some of our intellectual prejudices and some of our intellectual habits, to revisit the past, the present, and the future with perhaps new questions. That's the great hope, right, for an exciting book. And Radio for the Millions is such a book. Congratulations. One last slightly side note. I think that we have never been in a moment, and this is now us meeting as a post-pandemic crowd of academics, we've never been in a moment of such free and frank scrutiny of academic conventions, crises, and misdemeanors as we are seeing in the age of Twitter. Regardless of what we may like or not like about this moment, at its best, the social media conversation has led to greater self-reflection from younger scholars, as well as a more open recognition of scholarly positionality, its challenges, and its privileges. In that light, I want to thank Isabel for her personal note in the book's conclusion. I won't tell you what she writes, but I hope that me just mentioning this will resonate and move you to read the book, even if you start reading from the end. So I will stop there. Thank you, Isabel.
I just want to say, since she mentioned it, I have a picture of her.
Oh.
I think it's one of the slides after that. Right? That's her. Performing during the 1965. It's actually a stage one afterwards, because that's published in 1966.
I see.
Yeah, it's 1966.
So you can, we could ask you questions if you want.
I think we should go to questions.
So before we go to questions, I'm gonna just take a moment, just to just reflect very quickly, and then I'll open it for everyone. First of all, I do want to thank our presenters. I have to say that I think this was by far one of the most fascinating panels I've been in pre and post pandemic. It is so delightful to be in the presence of you and listen to work that is deeply and profoundly researched, and also and somehow completely not in contradiction, deeply and profoundly relevant and political, and also coherent, I think, and accessible to the public in large, and hopeful. So I really think that it's sort of, we have reached a place where it is really time to have more of these events. Specifically, I wanted to say what has been said, but I realized that after these presentations, even more. So I think we need to state it. Isabel is brave. Brave, yes. Because I have really thought, when I read it, I thought so, but now when I hear the commentaries, I realize the levels of how much you took on. It's actually shocking that you did it in 12 years and not in a lifetime, because think about it. One, she has produced an archive. It's much easier to attend an archive and, study the archive. It's really difficult to produce an archive. In producing an archive, you also have to convince the guardians of the old archives that not only are you not going to visit and argue with that, they actually don't matter. Thank you, I don't need it, creating my own. I think actually all four of us at the table have one thing in common in our very different works, which is contesting what an archive is, and not just by saying, knock, knock, please let me in, but by saying, I checked it, actually, not interested. I want to produce my own, and that my own is not delusional, it's not crazy, it is a different archive, and that different archive is this, the part 2 of the break, is not less history, right? It's not less official. It is not that common division that we hear time and time again in certain departments. They usually have a capital H, which is that, literature and cinema and radio and art, those are really nice things. But history, right? And what is that history? It tends to be post-Enlightenment, of course, and in the global South, as in the rest of the world, colonial documents or other documents produced under those conditions, right? So somehow you get those tiers of, and everything else that matters, if we want it to matter, has to be called pre-modern.
Yeah.
Pre-modern is okay, because that's like a pre. But if it's not pre-modern, it can't count as an official archive. It can be like a hobby, Like I like art, right? So that's brave number 2. Brave number 3, and Debashri made it very clear, is that, to do all of that and to work on sound, I do think is remarkable. It's the radio, it's sound, it's a question of the voice, because we still, and it's very much so, and I say this as somebody who works in the visual, you don't have to convince anybody that that the visual counts. That relationship between visual and text has been theorized through and through. At this point, really, the visual counts. It's a regime, right? And I don't think the same can be said for sound. And I think part of it is also, as you both mentioned, it is also a matter of the audience, and specifically with radio, the class, right? Class and sort of prestige, etc. So I think that those all come to my last point of why Isabel is so brave and why this book really, because you read the book and it's fascinating and it's so well written, but it's really is also more than that, and it's important. It was brought up, and I really think, two last things that I want to mention. We've all, we know that nations are imagination, we know all that, Anderson, but what we still find hard to really understand is, why is this imagination so compelling, right? Why is it? Part of it is that the epistemological frames and the knowledge that we are consuming time and time again, whether they are critical or supportive of the nation state as such, continues to take the nation state and national borders, even very recent ones, such as India and Pakistan, as the point of departure. Right? Point of departure, the kind of, uncontested, at best, something sad that happened, but, that's how it is now. So I think contesting that is important, but in the sense that Isabel's book also provides alternative frames, alternative modes of imagination. It's not enough to critique. You need to supplement with something else. So I think this is a really, in that sense, just a groundbreaking work. And finally, a brave, because it doesn't at any point attempt to be polite.
I tried, it was polite.
No, but it is remarkable. It is remarkable. I mean, for those of us who have attended the discussion of chapter 2 of Isabel's
That's right.
Chapter 2, which does address radio during Second World, and sort of the very contested and difficult relationship with German radio, and also and Nazi propaganda, etc. For those who attended the discussion, you might have remembered that there was a hysteria on trying within the discussion to rearrange things and explain certain things, like, yeah, this anti-Semitism doesn't count as anti-Semitism because this anti-Semitism is anti-colonial, right? Isabel's book doesn't do that. And it's important not to do that, just like not to do any other of the shortcuts. One, because that's actually not historical, but also because actually that's really not how life operates. I mean, it works in contradictions, and it's really nice that we want, for example, to think that in the process of decolonializing ourselves and knowledge, etc., we will be able to create very clear cuts between the goody goods and the baddie bads. Mm-hmm. But it's slightly more difficult than that. And that's, I think, why the book is so demanding and really remarkable that it only took 12 years.
Thank you.
And now we're going to open for questions. Well, I'll break the ice.
I don't need it.
For that.
I'll keep the
Okay. All right.
answer short. I
They should be here, sorry. So I was, one of the slides that you had up there showed all these little radio
Yes.
things, but I mean, talk about crossing borders. Could you elaborate a little bit more
I didn't
on
go
the
everywhere.
immense? No, I'm not. Thank goodness. Thank
Yeah, I
goodness.
can tell you about
But yes, I was like Denmark or Finland or something,
the
Southeast
fusion.
Asia. I mean, they were
Mhm.
all over the place, right? So it's not just India
Yeah.
and Pakistan.
Absolutely.
It's, yeah, so maybe you could elaborate a little bit.
Can we put it up? Is it possible? So, absolutely. I mean, a lot of what you're seeing are from World War II. So, a lot of what you're seeing during World War II, radio broadcasts were coming from Germany and Southeast Asia. Subhash Chandra Bose himself broadcast from Germany, from Singapore, from Japan, and from Burma. So you see those there. I consulted all of those. Those were actually collected by the British government because they were really into writing every single thing down that was said on the access radio. So I consulted those in Delhi. The ones, so that's the ones in the one Ceylon, which was now Sri Lanka, broadcast in the 50s, starting in the 50s, all the way till actually very recently. And what else? In Pakistan, I consulted. Islamabad has the largest collection, but I also worked in Lahore and in Karachi as well. In India, I didn't put everywhere that I worked. In India, literally almost in most major cities. In the north. Yeah, and that's about it. So the ones that you're seeing in Europe are all related to World War II broadcasts. They're all related to the to Subhash Chandra Bose's broadcast, as well as just German propaganda that became extremely popular during World War II and is addressed in the first chapter. And this becomes very important. It's news broadcasting, because this is really when radio's popularity explodes. At this time, there is very few radio receivers, and there's a variety of reasons for that. The main reason is the British fear that radio will become a loudspeaker for the anti-colonial movement. So there was lots of restrictions on receivers. But during World War II, despite the small amount of receivers, as soon as people know that they can access news in Hindustani, as well as in Bengali, but the large majority, the ones that I looked at were in Hindustani, it just exploded. And people would want to hear them in different places. They were played in stores, to the part that the British government banned the playing of radios in stores. And this is really where the concept of radio resonance emerged. I really found it in a contradiction that I found, which is there were such few radio receivers during World War II because of restrictions, and yet there was an obsession of the British government with banning listening to it. And it became very clear to me that there was a lot more listening taking place than what the actual receivers were. And that's radio resonance, how it begins, right? And that idea changes throughout the book. I hope that answered.
Just out of curiosity, how would you describe your relationship with the BBC archives of the radio? Because that is the most guarded place where they hide everything.
Hard. Yes. So the work on BBC that I did, there's an entire story. There can be another book written on the BBC Hindi and the BBC Urdu that emerges after the 1950s, and even all the way to the 80s. That's a whole other. But for the BBC Hindustani services that takes place during World War II, it was in response to the British propaganda. So that stuff is accessible because of the BBC written archives. When you come to later time periods, it becomes much harder. And I just haven't done, that's not something that I do in nearly as much detail.
Thank you. It was really, really fascinating. My question is, of course, to Isabel, but also to Dolores, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I was very struck by, obviously, the concept of radio resonance, but also the relationship, if any, between resonance, affect, and emotion. And I know that you touched a little bit upon perhaps radio's role in mobilizing emotions or even cultivating emotions. And it really brought to mind the way that we visit the archive in the history of emotions, especially in South Asia and more generally, as the text which is mobilizing either concepts of Josh or concepts of whether it's anti-colonial agitation or even gender and sexuality, in which those emotions are alluded to and then reformed and redefined in the textual sources. And I was thinking that now listening to you made me think that, well, I've been doing it all wrong. This is the other archive that I should have been perhaps looking at, where perhaps there is a little bit more force to the way that these emotions are marshaled when they're spoken to. And also the video that Debashri, you showed, that also really made me think of how, what is the relationship, one, of course, with, sorry, this is a long question, I should just stop, but like, what is the difference between the textual source and then radio and listening to it, and that in cultivating, mobilizing emotion, but then also from a point of view of today, the difference between the way that TikTok and other kinds of visual sources make us feel an affect and the way that just listening would make us feel, which goes back to the point about reverberating and other things that you were speaking about. I hope that made sense.
It does. It's just, I think the really important thing, and something that I try to bring up the story, is that there isn't really one way of listening. Listening itself and listening to the radio is culturally constructed. And that culturally constructed requires certain techniques of how we listen. And those techniques of how we listen are internalized in some way for those contemporaries. So some of what I tried to do was recover that. And I can give you a few examples. What radio resonance really is actually changes throughout the time period that I look at. So when you're looking at news broadcasts and you're looking at access radio propaganda and the way that that is spreading from one to the other one, the actual broadcast itself actually has very little importance. Very few people actually heard Subhash Chandra Bose's voice on the radio. Most people heard its rumor. So the voice, the broadcast itself, the talking about it is the most important. And it's the emotions that are passed through rumor that are really important. And rumor has a certain kind of affect that is different in other ways. It's about secret. And secret is so important to Subhash Chandra Bose's personality and who he becomes, right? And sort of, is he dead? Is he alive? Is he not here? And this begins earlier. This is his medium, right? It's part of the medium itself. That changes though. In the 1950s, when we have a lot more radio receivers, and then in the 1960s, when the book ends, and I'll just, there's something in the middle, but I'll go to the end, to the late 70s, following the 1965 war, transistors were well available by then. And actually listening to a recording would have been a lot more common than not listening to the recording. And yet radio resonance is still there. And radio resonance is at the heart of that, and it's part of the emotion. Why? Because the voice of the actual listener enters the radio, but it enters the radio through the ways in which the broadcaster is performing them, and through the letters that are read out loud, which Ines mentions in it, and the performance of those letters, right? And the kinds of emotions that the performance of those letters, and I look specifically at a cross-border program called Abbas de Kahange that sort of brings the two of them. It becomes really important. So it's a very long answer to say that there isn't one way of listening that creates certain emotions. I try to pay attention on how that is different across time period, across genre, and in relation to the ways in which individual listeners are actually interacting with them.
I always give the example in class when we talk about affect and listening and sound that if, especially for undergraduates, this resonates. Like it's your first quarter, first semester, you're having a horrible day, you're doing everything you can to hold it together. God forbid someone like your mom calls and you hear hello and you lose it, right? And it's that sound, but it's not really the sound of her voice, it's that relationship with that. You know, with that sound, right? And that seems to be the best example when we're doing listening exercises, right? Like who do you avoid, who you go to during certain specific moments. And that's all learned. That's all like socially constructed, culturally, you know, cultural values and whatnot.
Stern has this concept of adile, I can never pronounce it.
Yeah.
Adile is pronunciation, adile techniques. So listening is learned. There's certain ways of listening that you have to. So I try to pay attention to the various forms of listening.
Yeah.
There were hands here. I think David had
sorry.
a question.
Oh, yes. I did do that. Yes.
And there
Thank
are,
you.
there are
jumped
a
in, I
couple
should've
there
Fantastic.
also. If you lift them a little bit higher, then you'll be able to see.
Someone who is very much quoted in this book and cited over and over again.
So I have not finished the book, and but it's a real revelation to me the way you have approached the subject. I just want to question the optimism of it because of the immense power of the state, and we're seeing it right now with the BBC series on Modi, and people being bashed over their heads for trying to listen to it or watch it in this case. The attempt to close the boundaries and the resistance against it. So there is this battle going on. In the early years of radio, modeled on the BBC, it was a central government enterprise. And the news bulletins, for example, were written in the center in English and then translated for the early years. And they were, everything was written because they had to be vetted. That was the word that was used. And they were vetted, and people were excluded, you know all of that. And you've shown that people got away from that, and they were free, and yet the power of the state is immense. And in the period that you're studying after partition, the ability to cross that border, you could cross the border. And I was in India in the 60s, and I know it could be there, but it was hard. And it wasn't easy. With television, it became a little bit easier. Have a shortwave radio was not something that everybody had, and yet you show how that's combated, but still, it's there. And I think, as somebody was talking about voices, the voice I hear now all the time is Modi, Modi, Modi.
Yeah.
And it commands the scene. And the power of the immense multiplicity that grew up, I guess, in the late 1980s of media that knocked that whole thing out. Here's an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle and control it from the center. So that's a battle that's still going on, and you're more hopeful about it than I am.
I think I can respond in that in two ways. One is by, I think, the period that I studied. There's no question that imperial governments and national governments had a lot of influence in radio broadcasting, and each of the sections surely shows that. I think it is way too easy to give more states power more than they actually have. And when it comes to the study of radio broadcasting itself, from the period of the 1930s to the 1970s, there is no question that the stations that really, really won out the battle was certainly the stations that went against that. And one way to see that, and to really see that, is to think about what the people listened to. And Radio Ceylon was what they listened to. And the other thing is, of course, you could always say the borders are real. The radio did not bring down the borders. It's still not possible to bring down the borders, right? But I would say that the attempts to do that are incredibly valuable, and that it's our role as historians to study those as well. And the other one that I will answer for that is, if I'm often asked, so why did it all matter? Where did it all go? I think that the question of Hindustani becomes really interesting and very clear at showing this. Every single written source that you see will tell you that Hindustani did die. And in fact, it did. It's not available. Hindustani is an idea of a shared language that is neither Hindi nor Urdu and in between. If you look at, there is no government institution that uses Hindustani. There is no school that teaches it. And it's very hard to find literature that you can truly consider Hindustani at this level. If you think of Hindustani as a point of desire and living actually on the in the raid waves at the very time that it was declared dead. It was at its highest point, alive and well. And there was not a broadcaster until the late 70s more popular than Amin Sayani broadcasting on the radio. So if we start with the listener as the beginning and point, then the story is very different. If we start with the state, then the story is that. As to the Modi question, I addressed it very briefly in the introduction. I mean, that's sort of like asking a heart surgeon what they think of the liver. I don't study digital media at the end of it. But I do think that there's two lessons from it and two important ones. The first one is that, I mean, I think that it's really hard to say that digital media and that social media is going to sort of save the day. And I wouldn't go far as saying that the technologies are too different and the contexts are too different for that. But I would say that one of the lessons is that the importance of South Asia for understanding that, or the region at the center of it. And that questions to what it means to what digital media is and what it's doing that, South Asia is one of the best places to study. And the second one is that I wouldn't be too quick to give state governments more power than they deserve. So I wouldn't be too quick to make, because those grievances, what changes, how it's heard, actually happen on radio at the very moment that people actually try to control it the most. It was right after the 1965 war, after the most possible broadcasting that you can imagine, anti-India broadcasting that you can imagine in the 1965 war, that the IRR Urdu service thrived across both borders. It was right in the 1950s when film songs were banned from the radio that radios launched and thrived. So I would be careful to just too quickly give too much power.
Well, I think this is, on this note, we will end. Thank you, all of you, and thank you.
Thank you for coming.